All right, hello and welcome to the Step Up webinar on advocating for the EU Women's Helpline. Firstly, I would like to apologize for the wait. There were some technical difficulties. That happens every once in a while, but luckily we are online and ready to go. I'm Lena Piskernick, the Step Up campaign assistant, and will be presenting today. I would like to thank you for taking the time to be a part of this webinar today. I hope that it will be beneficial to your organization and look forward to the knowledge sharing that will occur. The webinar session is planned to run from 1 p.m. to 2. Depending on how the question and answer session goes at the end, we may even end a little before 2 p.m. I'd like to just quickly go over to the agenda of the webinar, which has also been emailed to you with a PDF of the presentation, which you can refer to in case of any kind of technical difficulties. I will also go over some housekeeping rules so that we can share information while also keeping it organized. I will take a few minutes to introduce myself to you and then begin the presentation by quickly going over the history of helplines. This will be followed by a short discussion of the topic of EU helplines and why we need to advocate for a helpline for women. My presentation should take about 25 minutes, after which I will take questions and comments from the audience. Going into the technical aspects. As an audience member, you are automatically muted. I will keep the muting on until the end of the presentation, after which you will be able to ask questions during the question and answer part of the webinar. I am not able to see you even if your webcam is on, and you are not able to see me. If you cannot see the PowerPoint, then please simply leave the webinar by clicking the X at the top right of your screen. You can join the webinar again by clicking the link in your confirmation email. Just letting you know, the webinar is being recorded. We have a few house rules that should make the webinar enjoyable for everybody. First, have a listen to my presentation. If you have any questions during this time, please feel free to type them into the questions pane. I will then answer your questions at the end of my presentation. During the questions and answers part, I will not be able to unmute everyone at the same time, but I can unmute individual participants. So if you have a question or a comment, then please raise your electronic hand, and then I will invite you to give us your question or commentary. Lastly, I hope that you will enjoy this webinar. First, I would like to give a short introduction of myself. My name is Lena Piskernick, and I am the Step Up campaign assistant at the WAVE office since September of last year. I am also in charge of planning and producing the webinars at the WAVE office. I have been researching the EU-wide helpline since starting at the WAVE, and I'm looking forward to sharing my knowledge with you as well as hearing about your opinions and experiences. All right, let's dive right into the presentation. First, I would like to begin by going quickly over the history of the helplines. Since WAVE is a European network, I have decided to concentrate solely on Europe. In Europe, the Samaritans in the United Kingdom were the pioneers of helplines by creating the first suicide helpline in 1953. Samaritans was founded by Chad Vara, a vicar in the Church of England. His inspiration came from an experience he had some years earlier as a young curate in the Diocese of Lincoln. He had taken a funeral for a girl of 14 who had killed herself because she feared she had contracted a sexually transmitted disease. In reality, she was menstruating. Vera placed an advertisement in a newspaper encouraging people to volunteer at his church, listening to people contemplating suicide. The movement grew rapidly, and within 10 years, there were 40 branches. Now there are 201 branches across the UK and Ireland, deliberately organized without regard to national boundaries on the basis that a service which is not political or religious should not recognize sectarian or political divisions. With the advent of the second wave feminist movement, women's helplines soon followed, with the first being created in the late 60s to early 70s, depending on which country we look at. But how are most helplines even created? What are the phases of the creation of helplines? Most helplines go through a similar evolution. First, they start out as a grassroots, do-gooder organization, often in some church basement or other folksy place. There is tremendous excitement and enthusiasm, extensive use of volunteers and community involvement. The next phase involves getting more structured, defined, hiring staff, an executive director, for example, and needing to do fundraising and developing budgets. The third phase is the professionalism phase, where procedures become more clearly defined, training is improved, and becomes more professionally clinically. Staff are in designated roles, experts provide supervision or training, and processes are more based on best practices and research. Funding becomes more guaranteed and adequate, and the program becomes integrated into the established service delivery community. The helpline is now part of the establishment, not on the fringe. The fourth phase seems to be the one of technological capability and specialization, where crisis lines become more computerized, highly organized, use technology effectively and in a thoughtful way, as well as start to branch out into specialized services such as teen lines, topic-specific hotlines, training consultations, or other crisis services. The very last phase is the phase of constant reinvention to continue survival. For example, adding the options to chat as well as email. So now let's move on to what exactly women's helplines are. National women's helplines are among the core services that women turn to for immediate support and advice. As such, they are the most vital support services for women experiencing violence, and they provide survivors of all forms of violence with specialist support tailored to meet their various needs. They provide support in the form of counseling, crisis intervention, online safety planning, and referral to relevant agencies. National women's helplines provide two important elements for women survivors of violence: information and emotional support. Women's helplines are often the first place to which women turn to when they are experiencing violence. This is where they try to find ways out of the violent lives which they are exposed to. Helplines are the path through which women often find their way to shelters. A country lacking a helpline is seriously lacking in support for the general female population. To meet the needs of women survivors of violence, a national women's helpline should operate 24/7, free of charge, be accessible on a national level, and have professionally trained staff. There's a number of reasons why a free of charge women's helpline is important, starting with calls to the helpline not being recorded on the phone bill and preventing the risk that the perpetrator finds out that the woman has contacted a women's helpline. Next, I would like to give a quick overview of what kind of organizations run women's helplines. According to the 2015 WAVE report, 72% of the national women's helplines, which do exist in Europe, are run by women's NGOs. The exceptions are Germany, Greece, Slovakia, and Spain, where governmental bodies run the national women's helplines. Although some countries may not have national helplines, this does not mean that there are simply no helplines in the country. Many states have regional helplines, such as Norway and Belgium, where each women's shelter operates their own helplines, assisting women survivors of violence. Then, there are also countries which have helplines that are gender neutral, meaning they are not specialized or gender specific. Many women's NGOs also complain of their government's move towards gender neutral legislation, which makes the support of women's helplines near to impossible. A question you may be asking yourself is, who is financing these helplines? According to the 2015 WAVE report, only 9 European countries have at least one national women's helpline which received state funding. These states are Austria, Bulgaria, Denmark, Ireland, Kosovo, Liechtenstein, Slovakia, Slovenia, and the UK. Some countries, meanwhile, receive no funding whatsoever from the state. These countries are Armenia, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Moldova, Russia, and Turkey. There seem to be two main reasons why governments do not fund helplines. One, a reported lack of government cooperation and involvement with women's NGOs. And two, a lack of legal mandate on government funding for specialist women's support. Some helplines also receive funding from both the state and other sources. Austria's Women's Helpline, for example, is mainly funded by the state, but the remaining budget is corporate funding. Liechtenstein's Women's Helpline, meanwhile, relies 60 to 70% on private donations. Slovakia and Estonia rely heavily on foreign donations, such as the European structural funds. There are also alternative programs and specific donors in some countries which specifically provide funding for national women's helplines. For instance, Women's Line in Finland is 95% funded every year by the Slot Machine Association. Now that we have a bit of an overview of women's helplines in Europe, let's go on and dive into how the EU-wide helplines even work. So, what are EU-wide helplines anyway? On February 15th, 2007, the EU Commission made the decision to reserve the national numbering range beginning with 116 for harmonized numbers for harmonized services of social value. With the development of the European single market and the freedom it offers, citizens within the Union are increasingly migrating to other European countries for various reasons. Women of every social sphere are vulnerable when they move to a new country, especially where they do not know the language. In order to help people in need, or in the case of an emergency, the European Commission felt the need to establish harmonized services that would be available in the EU. The Commission states that 112, the single European emergency number, and the 5116 helplines are a powerful message being sent to all Europeans in terms of safety and well-being. The numbers are easy to remember and free of charge. 116 can be essential in the report of a missing child, of an abuse, for victims of crime, or people who need emotional support. The Universal Service Directive requires the EU member states to promote the specific 116 numbers, ensure that disabled end users are able to access the 116 numbers, ensure that citizens are adequately informed of the existence and use of the 116 numbers, in particular targeting persons traveling in the EU, and lastly, to guarantee that citizens have access to a missing children hotline under the number 116000. Five EU-wide helplines already exist. The Missing Children Helpline is the European helpline to report missing children. The Victims of Crime Helpline gives people emotional support, informs them of their rights and how to use them, while also referring victims to the relevant organizations. The Child Helplines are for children who seek assistance and need someone to talk to. Non-emergency medical assistance directs callers to medical assistance when the need is not life-threatening. Emotional support helplines. The Emotional Support Helpline is a phone number for people suffering from loneliness or who are in a state of psychological crisis or thinking about committing suicide. So how does this helpline even work? The use of the helpline is quite simple. The assigned number, 116, is dialed, and then one is simply immediately connected with the helpline of their country. If there is no helpline available in your country, then the phone call will simply not connect. However, the helpline does not necessarily have to be a countrywide helpline. In Austria, for example, the non-emergency medical assistance number will connect with the local helpline of the state of Lower Austria. With the Women's Helpline, this could also be an option for your country. Not all EU member states have helplines for all of these numbers. The numbers which are not available are not advertised in the countries, so they will be less likely to be dialed. But if they are still dialed, the person will simply not be connected, unfortunately. Please also note that the member state picks which helpline to use for the EU-wide helpline. Well, why is it useful? What's the point of a helpline? The European Union Agency for Fundamental Rights study demonstrates that one of the primary needs of women victims of violence is to have someone to talk to and support them. Providing information, advice, and practical help for women is key, particularly when there is a lack of awareness about support available. Informing victims of their rights and their options, such as making a police report, referring to a women's shelter, or providing information on the forensic process, helps to ensure not only that their needs are met, but also that the journey to healing is manageable and achievable. This has, of course, been recognized by the Istanbul Convention, which has made it quite clear that women's helplines are an essential aspect of freeing women from the prison of domestic violence. The Istanbul Convention sets standards for the provision of a national women's helpline by stating that states must provide at least one national helpline to address all forms of violence against women, operating 24/7, free of charge, and in all relevant languages. Quote unquote, parties shall take the necessary legislative or other measures to set up statewide, round-the-clock telephone helplines free of charge to provide advice to callers, confidentially or with due regard for their anonymity in relation to all forms of violence covered by the scope of this convention. National women's helplines, as a specialist support service for survivors of violence, need to be based on a gendered understanding of violence against women and domestic violence, and shall focus on the human rights and safety of the victim, according to Article 18 of the Istanbul Convention. Furthermore, Article 22 states that the parties to the Convention shall provide or arrange for specialist women's support services to all women victims of violence and their children, which implies that specialist women's helplines are needed to provide adequate support. According to Article 24 of the Istanbul Convention, every country is obligated to provide a round-the-clock telephone helpline for women, which is free of charge or at the very least places due regard on their anonymity in all relevant languages. So what's the point if your country doesn't have a helpline? What's the point in advocating for this European-wide helpline anyways? In many regions in the EU and in Europe in general, specialist women's support services are wholly lacking. Where women's support services do exist, they often do not have the resources to make their services widely known, so that women are not often aware of the existence of such services. Only 15 out of 46 European countries provide a 24/7 helpline free of charge. Only 9 out of the 28 EU member states provide such a helpline. According to Article 24 of the Istanbul Convention, every country is obligated to provide around-the-clock telephone helpline for women, which is free of charge or at the very least places due regard on their anonymity. It is understandably frustrating that not all countries in Europe have a 24/7 helpline for women available. Funding for this issue unfortunately varies due to the country's policies and what kind of government is in place. What the creation of an EU-wide helpline can do for you is increase pressure on your government to provide funding for women's helplines. In short, this could be a great lobbying tool. If the infrastructure of the EU-wide helpline already exists and other countries' helplines are already part of this system, then one could use this as an argument. You would pretty much be saying, hey, look at all these other countries already having a national helpline. Why don't we have one yet? Lastly, I would like to go over an example of the Austrian Children's Helpline's evolution. Rat auf Draht, the Austrian Children's Helpline, actually started in 1987 as a TV show where children and teenagers could call to discuss issues they were having. It actually was started so that they would have a place to go for problems such as not having a safe walkway to school, or if their city was planning to construct a new building where their neighborhood's playground was. Many children and teenagers, however, began speaking about emotional and personal issues, and the TV show quickly evolved into a helpline where the youth could call regarding emotional issues as well. Rat auf Draht was first financed completely by the Austrian Broadcasting Corporation, ORF, but as of 1997, the Austrian Ministry of Interior took the helpline under its wings so that not only the Austrian Broadcasting Corporation finances it. As of 2003, all states of Austria participated in the financing of the helpline based on their population. Then, the international NGO Children's Villages became the main operator in 2014. The helpline is also now located in the Children's Villages offices in Vienna. Something important to note, however, is that only 30% of the helpline is financed by the state, while 70% is financed by big sponsors and donations. One of Rat auf Draht's largest sponsors is, in fact, Allianz, which is an insurance and asset management company. The reason why I find Rat auf Draht a good example to consider is because it actually started as a TV show with a completely different concept of what it is now. I hope that it might make the participants of this webinar think about how helplines don't necessarily always have to start via telephone operators in a church basement somewhere. Perhaps a helpline nowadays could start as a YouTube series where questions are read out loud and then answered. There are so many options out there. Don't be afraid to try out new ideas. We are now nearing the end of my presentation, and I would like to leave you with a quote by Nuria Agno. She could just pack up and leave, but she does not visualize what's beyond ahead. Every woman has the right to a life free from violence. So many women are in desperate situations where they simply just want to leave, but do not know of their options and where to go. Helplines would be the first place where they would find emotional support and guidance during this difficult time. Helplines would assist these women to visualize what is beyond this trying time that they are facing. All right, so the presentation is now ended. Thank you for paying attention, even through the technical difficulties occasionally. Just to let you know, the video of this webinar will be made available in a few weeks. I may have to edit it a little before I send it out. Also, there will be a worksheet which summarizes the information which you have listened today. I will send it out by the end of next week, I believe. So let's start with answering some questions that have been sent to me during the presentation. I'm looking at the questions right now, and there's no written questions. I'm going to check if anybody has raised a hand. And nobody has raised a hand. Okay. Maybe you would like to share some concerns about what's going on in your country regarding helplines, or some also good practices. Oh, I see there's two. Let's start with Eugenia. I'm going to unmute you now. All right. Hello, Eugenia. How can I? What question can I answer for you? Eugenia? Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay. Hello. I'm Eugenia. I'm from Italy. I'm based in Udine, so close to Austria, and I am a member of the Commission on Equal Opportunities of the municipality. And I got to know WAVE through my international work in Moldova and other countries. I am very interested in the last example that you mentioned about the Rat auf Drach, the children's helpline that started as a TV show. You said that sometimes it can start also as a YouTube program or something like this. Right now I am I'm trying to promote two things at the Commission. The engagement of men and boys, and I was wondering how this could be done also. Maybe this is a bit not directly related to the topic of survivors of violence, but I will come to where it is also related. So one is, are there examples? Can you explain a little, give more details about YouTube programs? Maybe there are links that you can share, and also how to use this tool, meaning also YouTube and new technologies, to better attract migrant women.
Well, for the YouTube links, first of all, thank you for your question. For the YouTube links, I can definitely research that and then send it to all of you, all the participants next week. I'm sure I can find some YouTube videos that are similar to this kind of idea that I had. Honestly, the idea of like having a YouTube question and answer session was just something that came to me that I thought would be a great idea anywhere. Regarding integrating migrant women in this more, WAVE does work with PICUM, so that is also something that we could discuss with them to see that migrant women are involved in are actually like seen and heard. And therefore I could also provide you with contacts with PICUM if you would like, since we've been working very closely with them lately. They were even at our offices actually 2 days ago. If that would be all right with you, Eugenia?
Yes.
Eugenia?
Yes, thank you.
Thank you. Okay. And Katalin, I'm going to unmute you. So you. Hello.
Hi. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay, great. So I'm Katalin from Hungary, and I'm an activist for NANE organization. We run the only helpline for women and children who suffered or who were suffering violence, domestic violence specifically. My question would be around these 116 numbers, whether there is one specific number for this topic or there may be more. I'm telling you why this is a question for me right now, because I know that the government is setting up violence-related mostly non-gender specific helplines, and I'm wondering whether maybe we could be redirected by this number, or if the state-funded lines will get the number, or if anyone can, how it can be get. I'm just wondering here how it will go.
Well, the thing is that the member state itself decides what number they will use. So essentially, you would have to lobby with your politicians to be essentially given access to that number, so that you would be like redirected to that number. The fact that it's gender neutral, of course, is a sad problem that we're having all over Europe, unfortunately. I think specifically you're talking about just like a gender neutral helpline for people who are experiencing violence.
Domestic violence also, but it's...
Yeah. So it's specifically domestic violence, because I know the EU already has a EU-wide helpline for just victims of violence. So
specific, and my fear, my concern is that it's gender neutral. It's not specific. It does not attend probably, or I'm fearing that it doesn't attend the specific needs of women and children.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that's an unfortunate problem we're having in not just Eastern Europe, the gender neutrality that is coming through. What we can do is, I mean, WAVE is having its annual conference in Budapest, October 30th to November 1st this year. We can, you're of course invited. What we can do is we can work on this. Everybody's invited, by the way. But we could maybe set up a workshop specifically to that. So how about, I mean, I've written your name down, and I have your contact. I can, as the conference moves closer, we can stay in contact and discuss this more. And I mean, gender neutrality is a pretty horrible problem. That's so many European countries are facing. So we can also set up a working group at WAVE for gender neutrality.
Great.
Oh,
great.
We already have one. So we're okay, cool. So we're starting a gender neutrality working group next year that we can involve you in as well. But yeah, so you have our full support.
Sounds like a plan.
Yeah, lots of fun.
Yeah. Okay. Let's stay in touch.
Okay, great. Looking forward to it.
Thank you.
All right. I'm gonna check and see if there's any written questions. Maybe. No? No more questions coming up. I mean, if you come up with a question in a few hours, I realize you have to let it sink in. Feel free to contact me. You have my office email. I've sent you an email with all of the PDFs, And all right, I would just like to thank you for attending my webinar. Oops, somebody's still not muted, but okay.
Sorry.
So it's okay. I would like to thank you for attending my webinar, and I hope to see y'all participate at our next upcoming webinar on July 5th, which will be on the topic of femicide. So have a nice rest of the day, and have a nice weekend too, and I hope to see all of you soon in the end of October in Budapest, hopefully.